They called it the place where light forgets to reach. Pelican Bay State Prison's control unit wasn't just another cell block, it was the system's coldest experiment. A place designed not to punish the body, but to erase the mind. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. The control unit began in the late 1980s, born out of chaos. California's prison system was bursting at the seams with violence, stabbings, gang wars, and riots that made headlines nationwide. The state needed a solution that could contain what they saw as the worst of the worst. And so they built Pelican Bay, tucked deep in the fog-drenched forests near the Oregon border. From the outside, it looked like a fortress carved into concrete silence. Inside, it became a laboratory for total control. No bars, no open yards, just solid steel doors and tiny windows that filtered in slivers of gray light. Inmates spent 22 to 23 hours a day alone. Meals came through slots. Voices were replaced by the hiss of fluorescent lights. Many of the men sent there had already spent years in maximum security, but the control unit was different. It wasn't about discipline, it was about isolation. Prison officials called it a way to break gang influence. But to the men living it, it felt like being buried alive. One former inmate described it years later: "You stop being a person in there. You become an echo." Rumors began to spread through the general population. Stories of men who started talking to the walls, scratching words into the paint until their fingers bled. Guards said it was just manipulation, a tactic for sympathy. But even some officers admitted, after a few months working those corridors, you start to feel the walls breathe back at you. By 1993, the control unit had already become infamous. Lawsuits started stacking up, accusing Pelican Bay of psychological torture. The media was kept at a distance, and when reporters did get inside, what they saw barely scratched the surface. What the public didn't know, what the state didn't want anyone to know, was that something had begun to crack deep inside that sealed wing. Not a wall, not a door, but a code. A silent rebellion that would soon force the system to look at its own creation. Because in a place designed to crush all human connection, someone found a way to speak again. And the message they sent out would change everything. It started with a note, no longer than a cigarette paper, folded so tightly it could pass through the thin slit of a food slot without being seen. No one knows who wrote it first. Some say it came from a man in Depot, one of the few who still had access to the library. Others claim it was passed between cells through the plumbing system, a code whispered through the pipes. The message was simple: we are still here. In Pelican Bay's control unit, communication was supposed to be impossible. No group meetings, no visits without glass. Every letter was read, every movement recorded. Yet somehow, through the walls and vents, the inmates had rebuilt a network, a kind of underground telegraph of survival. If the officers knew, they didn't speak of it openly. Some of them didn't have to. They could sense the change. The silence that once suffocated the block now pulsed with something different: rhythm, purpose, defiance. Behind the control room glass, guards watched monitors flicker between cells. A man pacing. Another doing push-ups in the dark. But the cameras couldn't catch the moments that mattered: the coded knocks on the walls, the slow rebellion forming under their noses. By the mid-1990s, pressure was building from both sides. The California Department of Corrections claimed Pelican Bay was essential for safety, but lawyers and human rights investigators were closing in. They wanted to know what safety meant when men hadn't touched sunlight in years. Some guards began to crack. One former officer, interviewed later under anonymity, described nightmares of the place. You walk in there, and it's like time stops. You forget you're still part of the world. Inside, the inmates had begun to map the system. They learned the routines: the sound of footsteps before a shift change, the hum of the fluorescent lights before power checks. They learned which guards would look away and which would make you disappear into disciplinary segregation, an even smaller cell inside isolation itself. And then came the report. In 1995, the U.S. Department of Justice released findings from a 2-year investigation. The results were damning: systematic abuse, excessive force, and psychological harm so severe it bordered on cruelty. For the first time, the public saw inside Pelican Bay's hidden core, the control unit that had operated like a shadow government. But the report wasn't the end. It was the spark. Because when those findings hit the news, something unexpected happened inside the prison itself. The very people the system had tried to silence realized their voices had made it out. For the first time in years, men in solitary felt heard. And that's when hope, dangerous, fragile hope, crept into the corridors of Pelican Bay. But hope, in a place built on control, can be as explosive as rage. And when it finally ignited, it would test just how far the system was willing to go to keep its walls intact. The first spark came quietly, an unplanned hunger strike in one of Pelican Bay's most restricted pods. A few trays pushed back through the slot. A message scratched on the floor in soap: "We refuse." Within days, the silence that once defined the control unit was broken by something far louder: collective defiance. It wasn't the kind of rebellion the state expected. There were no weapons, no fights, no riots. Just the one thing Pelican Bay was never built to withstand: unity. Word spread cell to cell, building to building. By the end of the week, hundreds of men across California's prisons had joined in solidarity. Some hadn't spoken to another human in years, but now, through hunger, they were speaking for all of them. The protest drew national attention. Families of inmates began to organize outside, holding signs that read "End long-term isolation." Civil rights groups demanded reform. Lawmakers were forced to answer questions they had avoided for decades. Could a democracy justify burying thousands of men alive in silence? Inside the control unit, the air grew colder. Guards patrolled with clipped expressions. Medical staff moved through the corridors, checking vitals but avoiding eye contact. For some inmates, it became a test of will; for others, it became a form of freedom. One man reportedly whispered through the vent, "They can't ignore us now." Weeks passed. Dozens were hospitalized. The administration finally opened negotiations, quietly agreeing to review the security housing unit policies that had kept men locked away indefinitely. It was a small victory, but in Pelican Bay, small victories felt like revolutions. Years later, the ripple spread beyond those walls. Lawsuits forced the Department of Corrections to rethink indefinite solitary confinement. Thousands of prisoners across the state were eventually released back into the general population or transferred to lower security levels. But for those who lived through it, the scars remained. Psychologists who later interviewed former control unit inmates described symptoms that mirrored battlefield trauma: disassociation, panic at the sound of silence, fear of open spaces. The human mind, it turned out, wasn't built for that kind of emptiness. Today, the control unit at Pelican Bay stands as both a warning and a lesson. Its legacy still echoes through debates on human rights, mass incarceration, and the true meaning of rehabilitation. Some call it progress. Others call it too late. But if you listen closely, to the wind against the concrete, to the ghosts of those echoing corridors, you can almost hear the same message that started it all: we are still here. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.